Listen, asshole. You got a gun pointed right at your...
Unlike other venues in the entertainment industry, video games have proven to be one of the most unpredictable yet profitable ventures a creator could undertake. But more so than films and TV, public opinion can often be the difference between profit and failure. A developer can potentially lose everything if they're not able to satisfy their customers. As such, understanding what players want in their games is vital in order to triumph in this business. But sadly, this is easier said than done. No one can truly predict which games will succeed and which will fail. There are too many factors at play which can determine if a product will triumph over the market. People can Fly know this better than most other developers. Over the years, they've struggled to maintain public interest in their games while they faced financial difficulties. So in 2021, when they released a brand new third-person shooter, I imagined that they hoped that this would be the break they were waiting for. A game which could finally turn their world around and catapult them to newfound fame. So the question is, why hasn't it? Well, with the new expansion coming out this year, I thought I'd take a closer look at this cross-gen game, and see for myself if it had anything noteworthy to offer the industry as a whole. If not, then hopefully it'll simply be a fun game for people to play. There's only one way to find out. This is Outriders. Taking place in the middle of the 21st century, the Earth has become virtually uninhabitable due to constant war. As a result, the Earth's governments have joined together in a desperate attempt to save humanity. Not by saving the Earth itself, but by abandoning it. With their plan being to travel to an Earth-like world called Enoch. Here, the newly formed ECA hoped to start civilization over. But it didn't take long after humanity's arrival on Enoch for things to go horribly wrong. You play as an Outrider, a member of an elite task force, ordered to scout out the planet and pave the way for the colonists. But after finding yourself in a massive forest, you and the rest of your team discover the anomaly. A massive energy storm which alters the biology of anyone who comes into contact with it, often resulting in their deaths. You and your team attempt to warn the rest of humanity of the anomaly, but it's too late. Before you can do anything to stop the arrival of the colonists, you end up being betrayed and wounded, forcing you to be put back into cryostasis until you're fully recovered. You reawaken 31 years later only to find the ECA's attempt at colonizing the planet has failed. With everyone trapped in a single mountain valley and the anomaly destroying all of humanity's advanced tech, the ECA has become engaged in a massive civil war for control over what little resources they have left, while those who have survived exposure to the anomaly, like the Outrider, have become altered, mutated humans possessing supernatural powers. During this time, the Outrider manages to reunite with what's left of the ECA, who are simply struggling to keep themselves alive. With very few options left, it's now up to you to try and carve out a better future for humanity on this planet before everyone dies. On paper, it sounds like a pretty bleak narrative, but I gotta say, despite how complicated the story sounds, it's actually pretty generic once you start to peel back its layers. Sure, the premise alone is enough to capture your attention, but after the prologue it becomes evidently clear that there isn't a whole lot of complexity present in this story. In fact, it's actually pretty fucking bland. So much so that I can't even remember the names of half the characters in this game. Most of them are just a collection of generic action stereotypes anyway. Also, it doesn't help that many of them end up getting killed shortly after you meet them, while the voice actors themselves do little to help endear you to anyone.
Sorry I left you to die in that med lab.
Hey, no worries.
Didn't really have a choice.
I'd have done the same.
As time went on, I had the impression that the story was trying to build itself up to something big. A grand revelation that will recontextualize the whole game, and granted, there is something like that at the story's end, but it's not as mind-blowing as the writers seem to think it is. In fact, it's kinda obvious when you stop to think about it. The sad truth is, the writers clearly put a lot of work into the initial setup of this game's narrative, with the world itself being the most well thought out aspect of the game's story. I won't deny that there were plenty of moments throughout where I was left genuinely intrigued by this vast alien world, yet these instances were constantly being undercut by a slew of underwhelming ideas and a poorly written script, resulting in a story that's just completely forgettable, which is a shame. Although that being said, even if the writing fails, there is one part of this game that excels, and it's the combat. Outriders is a good example of game mechanics outshining its narrative, because while the story is pretty forgettable, the combat is a lot of fun. This is thanks in no small part to how the combat encounters are set up. From the start to the end of your journey, you have to contend with hordes of both men and monsters, some of whom will pick you off from a distance while others will charge right at you with no thought to their own well-being. More often, you have to contend with a mixture of the two, forcing you to constantly remain on the move, keeping an eye out for viable cover and switching to your other weapons should you run out of ammo. The planet Enoch is full of danger at every turn, so you'll need every advantage at your disposal if you want to survive, and that all starts with what class you pick. Outriders is a third-person cover-based shooter with a number of RPG elements mixed into its gameplay. For starters, after you've completed the prologue, you get to choose one of the game's 4 classes, each of which have their own strengths, weaknesses, and unique abilities that are tailored for a specific playstyle. Whether you want to fight at a distance, up close, or even a blend of the two, there's something for everyone, and thankfully there are no weapon restrictions. However, what I've personally found to be the biggest deciding factor for choosing your class would be in regards to your health regeneration. Unlike other shooters where your health naturally regenerates all by picking up certain items, here you have to kill your enemies with methods tailored to a specific class. For example, with my first playthrough I chose the Technomancer class, which prioritized long-range combat. As such, I was able to regain health simply by dealing damage to my enemies. But then when I tried playing as a Pyromancer, a medium-ranged class, I had to use my class's skills in order to regain health, which at first didn't seem like much of a difference gameplay-wise. However, since I had to use my skills more sparingly than normal, I found myself struggling a lot more in combat than I ever did as a Technomancer. That was until I realized that a Pyromancer's abilities were designed for taking on groups rather than individuals. By comparison, the Technomancer prioritized individual targets since you were able to heal so much more easily. Clearly, one class is better suited to playing in single player, but more importantly, it highlights a key detail of Outriders' game design. It forces you to play aggressively. You can't simply stay in cover all the time. Instead, the game pressures you to face your enemies head on, whether through its aggressive AI or due to a lack of resources. Outriders is a game that expects a lot from the player, and it's ultimately up to you if you meet its challenge. It's not the kind of game style that I was expecting from a cover-based shooter, but from an RPG, definitely. Speaking of which, every class comes equipped with its own skill tree. As time goes on, you'll be able to improve the effectiveness of your weapons and abilities, but that's not all. Like any good RPG, you'll be spending most of your free time collecting loot and swapping out your gear for ones with slightly higher stats. Whether by finding chests in your environment or by completing missions, there are many avenues to acquiring loot. That said, if you do find a piece of gear you want to keep around, then thankfully the game allows you to upgrade it. So if you end up finding a weapon or piece of gear you really like, then you'll be less likely to get rid of it. Furthermore, you'll also be able to swap out your gear's abilities with any you've already discovered, allowing you to effectively customize your character however you like. This freedom to experiment with your character will be needed, especially in preparation for Outriders' endgame. That said, gunfights can become quite repetitive after a while. Personally, I'd hoped that after the first couple of chapters we'd start dealing with more variety in terms of enemy design. But the truth is, if you play through the first few hours of this game, then you basically played the entirety of Outriders. Pretty much every quest in this game revolves around you traveling to a particular area and killing everyone present, usually concluding with what this game considers to be a boss and then you move on. Sure, they might give the enemies different looks to fit their environment, but that's about as far as they go in terms of variety. With the exception of a couple bosses, this game is just full of reskinned enemies. Hell, even the game's final boss is just a reskin of a previous enemy. Also, it doesn't help that the level design gives away what kind of enemies you'll be fighting. If there's plenty of cover, then you can expect to fight a lot of ranged enemies. If there's a large open space, then you'll mostly be contending with enemies up close. So even without taking the environmental cues into consideration, it's pretty easy to deduce what awaits the player around every corner. Furthermore, if you want the best loot in the game, then you better be prepared to work for it. Cause if you play Outriders on the lowest difficulty, then you're basically stuck with basic gear. Similar to Diablo's own difficulty system, Outriders' world tier system effectively rewards you for playing the game on the higher difficulties, meaning that while you have a higher chance of death, the loot you find in game will be a lot rarer, so there's good reason to challenge yourself. But that said, the tier system isn't perfect. More often I found myself struggling on the higher difficulties simply because the enemies became so much more durable, making some firefights feel like they go on forever. Thankfully, you can change the difficulty on the fly if you're struggling, so it's not exactly a mechanic that's forced upon the player. It's one that you're better off testing in order to find the right difficulty level for you to enjoy the game. That being said, if you're struggling, then maybe the best option is to simply invite some friends over to play a game with you. You can play Outriders with up to 3 friends online, so you can potentially end up with a squad featuring every class in the game, although do keep in mind that the difficulty scales to whoever is the party leader, so it's best to make sure that whoever is running the session isn't 10 levels higher than everyone else, otherwise you may end up dying more frequently than usual. Although if you're like me and prefer to play alone, then sadly, like many other modern games, Outriders requires an internet connection in order to work. Not just so you can log into the game, but so you can access all your information, from your characters to your saved games and anything else Outriders may need, which frankly is really frustrating. I mean, I know that the developers had intended this game to be multiplayer focused, but they didn't have to do this. From a single player standpoint, this is still an entertaining third-person shooter. Despite the lack of variety with the actual combat encounters, the RPG elements add a lot of complexity to the overall gameplay. Furthermore, while the quality of loot drops are entirely reliant on difficulty, thanks to the various upgrade mechanics, you can easily transform even the most mundane gun into the perfect killing machine. If they'd simply spent more time on refining the individual components of this game, then I could certainly see this being one of the best third-person shooters in recent history. But as it is now, now, it's just average. Still, at least there are no microtransactions, so silver lining? When it comes to the game's music, I wish I had more positive things to say. For an action-orientated game, the soundtrack does a good job of evoking the fast-paced and chaotic nature of Outriders gameplay, but sadly they didn't do enough to help the music stand out for me. Most of these tunes sound almost identical to each other or simply follow a similar beat, making it hard to tell them apart. A good soundtrack should be able to stand on its own while also complementing the game it's a part of, which unfortunately Outriders doesn't do. Unlike the sound design, which manages to both complement the gameplay while also exist as its own separate entity, featuring a good blend of natural environmental sounds, weapon-based tones, and fictitious melodies created by the more unnatural aspects of the game. The sounds present in Outriders help to encapsulate the constant sense of danger and mystery in this game's world, while also retaining the more familiar and simple tones suitable for a story set in humanity's future. This is a sentiment that's been shared by the game's visuals as well. I gotta say that the graphics in this game are superb. There are many different environments which you'll end up traversing through in Outriders, the vast majority of which are simply stunning. From human settlements which have been overtaken by nature to even war-torn trenches reminiscent of real history. The sheer scale and detail present in this game's world easily surpasses anything found on the character models. The developers clearly worked hard to make every location in this game shine. Not to mention it helps sell the idea that you're really just a tiny speck lost on an alien world. I only wish that this level of detail was consistent across the whole game, but it became clearer as I played that the quality of Outriders' visuals was noticeably lax in certain areas. The character models, for example, all seem to blend together after a while, with many of them, both enemies and friendly NPCs, seemingly sharing the same outfits and physical characteristics with very little diversity. Same could be said for the weapons, with the most visually diverse designs being reserved for the rarer guns, while the rest only seem to share a difference in color and texture. Also, while the player does get to create their own custom character at the start of the game, there aren't that many options when it comes to personalizing said character. I mean, I wasn't expecting Skyrim levels of player customization, but still, a few extra hairstyles and facial features would have been appreciated. Furthermore, while the game's UI is easy to read, it's pretty bland to look at. For a game that's set in the far future, you'd think they'd lean more into that and have some fun with the game's UI, but that's more of a minor nitpick than a genuine complaint, really.
Fuck, seriously?
War is war. What, you think we just hug it?
Why do I even bother?
You wanna know something funny? I actually started working on this review last year, yet every time I thought about going back to playing this game, I always found myself playing something else instead, which is quite bizarre. I mean, I wouldn't consider Outriders a bad game. The combat as a whole is quite enjoyable, the RPG elements can provide you with some replay value, as does the multiplayer, and at times this game can be quite pretty. So why is it that I don't enjoy this game as much as I should? Well, I guess it's because it's nothing new. It's just another standard third-person shooter. Granted, the setting itself is pretty cool, but the story doesn't take full advantage of it. It does a good job of setting up the many mysteries of this world, but any actual payoff to them proves to be more mundane than I ever expected. It also doesn't help that most of the dialogue sounds as if it's been ripped straight from a Michael Bay movie. You can't get more generic than that. The fact is, there was a lot of potential here, yet the developers never seized upon it, so by the end of the game you kinda just end up bored with the whole experience. I guess I was just expecting something more from Outriders. Who knows, maybe the upcoming expansion will deliver on its promises, but at this point I don't see it happening, nor do I intend to find out. Anyway, that's all the time we have for today. I'm the Grave Tender, and thank you for joining me on the other side. Please consider subscribing, and I hope you all have a nice day.